Okay. Hello, I am extremely pleased to introduce Chiara Bonacchi to our YOHRS, our first YOHRS seminar of this term. She is a lecturer in heritage at the University of Stirling and received her PhD from the UCL Institute for Archaeology. And she has incredibly innovative research in digital public archaeology. She is the instigator of the wildly successful and very interesting crowdsourcing project, MicroPass, which we'll be hearing about a little bit. No, okay. Well, never mind. Just look it up on the internet, it'll be fine. Great, so her talk tonight is Rethinking Digital Heritage Research, Practices, Epistemologies, and Ethics. Looking forward to it, so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colleen. So I'll start with this. Yes, disappointing news that my class is official anyway. I'm sorry. And in fact, my idea today was to talk about digital heritage research, drawing on another case study, which is my most recent research. It's another YOHRS-funded project, which I will anticipate now, actually, called Ancient Identities in Modern Britain. It's a collaboration between, well, previously UCL and now Stirling University, and Durham University, both the Archaeology department with Richard Hingley, who's PI, and Tom Yarrow in social anthropology, who's the second co-I in addition to me. And this is a project that is roughly, you can say, split in two parts. Half, from a methodological point of view, focuses on the digital heritage side, which I'm looking after, and I'm working with Marta Shijanka, who's a research assistant on the project, while also doing her PhD in Cambridge. And the other half sits in Durham, and it's focused instead on the offline ethnography site. And the project as a whole looks at how the Iron Age, Roman, and early medieval past of Britain is experienced and lived in contemporary Britain, but looking also to situate the case study with all the regional variabilities that there are, and there are lots, in the wider European context. It aims to document the contrasting values that pertain to these different heritages. Essentially looks at how materials, objects, and practices from this past that I've mentioned, Iron Age to early medieval, is experienced today in this country. What I will focus on is a large part of the research that I'm doing, which has in little part been published last year in the Journal of Social Archaeology. This study looked at the heritage of Brexit and how, again, the prehistory to early medieval past featured in social media discussions about Brexit, and particularly in Facebook discussions about Brexit. Now that I have clarified this point, I'm going to introduce the topic. So what I would like to do is really to revisit aspects of theory and practice by engaging with technicity through the case study that I have mentioned. Because digital heritage research up to now has been a very thriving and growing and important field. But in terms of, and especially so in the last 10 years or so, but in terms of published literature, the majority of the work is really about digital cultural engagement and digitization. And there is less work that looks particularly at digitally enabled research within heritage studies, particularly of a social research kind. And the literature that there is tends to be polarized either towards work that is very theoretically rich and really important, and it deals with issues like for example, social justice or ethical aspects, but is not directly built from the ground up and not directly drawing on empirical work. And at the other end, there is lots of data rich and important empirical work, but sometimes a bit theory thin, like a bit under-theorized. So this is an attempt to try and look at some concepts, grounding them in a case study that, again, engages with technicity, understood as the technology which is considered in its efficacy and operating functioning. And in a world that is increasingly of big data, so in the world that we're living in, where the web is more and more interconnected, technicity is part of both the methodology being used and also of the subject being investigated. In the particular case study that I will look at, which I will intersperse with some considerations while I'm looking at it, we were looking at 3 core research questions. So how has the ancient past been called upon in social media discussions about Brexit? Again, particularly looking at Facebook. How have people's perceptions and experience of these periods impacted on their political identities and their hoped for political futures? And what has been the impact of expert practices on shaping, in terms of shaping those perceptions and experience? And how is the expertise of archaeologists and historians related to education practice and media communications as well? We started from an understanding of heritage as the processes and outcomes of interacting with the past in contemporary society, attributing social and cultural values to the past. And therefore, an understanding of digital heritage as both a process and an outcome, a process of interacting with the past through interactions that are enabled by the internet, and as outcomes, so in terms of digital footprints and big data. Then we also drew on the work of Christine Hine, who explains that human activities in her book, Internet Ethnographies, can unfold across online and offline fields. And she argues that for this reason, ethnographic investigation undertaken online should be conceived as potentially interlinking with offline ethnography rather than separate from it. So we tried, and I will explain how, to establish how the agency that we were looking online was linked to what was going on offline. And expanding on this idea, we defined a context of heritage production to be any activity occurring online or offline, as part of which human and non-human agents engage with the past more or less incidentally. So in our case, basically the field of investigation that we were focusing on primarily was Facebook, and the context of heritage production was political microactivism. Political microactivism defined as Marikal defines it. So he talks about social media microactivism as a form of political activism that is primarily intended to express the hopes and the kind of futures that people want to see happening, rather than aimed at trying to mobilize change offline. So it's a way, looking at this kind of activism on social media is a way of looking at how people are shaping their political identities, how people are thinking about the future, essentially. And to analyze digital heritage processes, we turn to look at digital heritage outcomes data. When we approach online fields to examine uses of the past in the present, it is likely that our questions will be answered if we are able to navigate, and this term is quite key, and I'll explain how, big digital heritage data, especially if our research focuses on social media data. And big data has been variously defined as being large in volume, exhaustive in scope, relational, of high velocity, variety, flexibility, fine granularity, and these definitions are being constantly refined. A very recent study by Kitchen has, in drawing on extensive empirical research, has actually also clarified that actually we can say that big data is data that possesses most of these attributes, but not necessarily has to have them all. Now, in our work, and this is why I said navigating big data, we used open source research software, and particularly primarily R, very simply, and Python, to build workflows with which we have been extracting posts, comments, and replies. So all the text contained in public Facebook pages that featured Brexit as a keyword in their title or their description. And we extracted in this way about 1.4 million messages. So in order to do this, that was really the process of navigating big data and extracting this material. Then the subset of data, and we also analyze, as I will say, the data set as a whole to understand what topic featured. But then the specific messages where the past that we wanted to look at appeared were a lot less, were in fact about 2,500. So definitely nothing like even a large, probably, data set, just a larger data set that you can analyze quantitatively. And to locate these messages, we prepared a list of 568 keywords that were linked to people, places, and ways of describing periodization relating to these three periods, so Iron Age, Roman, and early medieval Britain. Now, before I move on to talk about a bit of the analysis, there is another point which is important and I think needs to be addressed, which is that of data structures and heritage utilizers. And it's an important one to understand the kind of knowledge that we can produce through these methodologies. In explaining the genesis and the management of big data, Twitter identifies three core groups of stakeholders: generators, companies, us essentially using social media data, social media platforms, collectors, so the companies that are collecting this data and decide how these structures should look like, and then the utilizers, including the researchers that are using the data in order to do research. So big data is never raw, it is pre-cooked. It's got a particular structure which already constrains the kind of questions that can be asked and can potentially, of course, also orientate research agendas in a direction or another. And here we can see also that immense epistemological weight that the commercial world has been themselves able to define the data structures that are available. There is power also in the hands of utilizers and therefore researchers in different ways. However, here there is another aspect that should be taken into consideration, which is that of technicity that I was talking about at the beginning. So the ability to engage technically with this material, which is also to some extent the only way to actually know how these structures are organized, because there is no real manual or coherent instructions that you find unless you actually really start dealing with it and seeing how it looks like and how it changes as well, very frequently too. So there are three main routes of extracting this data. One is through the application programming interface. You access the database in the way in which the company decides that you will be able to do that. With the complication that recently, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook has changed basically the rules, if you like, to access the API, requiring that whether the utilizer develops and verifies an application in order to access all the levels of information, even of a public Facebook page, whereas previously you were able to extract them all, to extract all the levels that were contained in a public Facebook page, from posts to comments and replies. Now you can only do posts without registering. Something similar to what had happened to Instagram in 2016, which, as Catherine Graham said, really meant that only those seeking to commercialize users' data could access this data. This again creates a massive power imbalance in terms of who owns this material and who can use it, and who cannot, essentially. So again, the importance of actually doing this kind of research actively. The other route, obviously this route is a complicated one in terms of interoperability, because the API changes very frequently, and so it becomes difficult to then deal with these differently structured kinds of data that then can also be accessed in different ways. It requires adapting workflows quite frequently. The second route is through scraping, so scraping as the material appears essentially through a browser. Maybe these changes are less frequent because they relate to how the web page looks, and companies tend to try and preserve the overall feel of the platform more, but requires even more competencies on the part of the person who's doing it. And finally, buying the data, which is extremely expensive and only available for certain platforms like Twitter. What we started with doing in our case study was trying to understand, again, the kind of agency that there was behind this platform, and understand how the groups and individuals active online were relating with those active offline. So we looked at the metadata of the Facebook pages and analyzed it qualitatively. We saw that half of the pages created by groups, half of the pages were created by groups that were also established offline. For example, basically groups that were defined by political affiliation, or that were gathering around business interests or social concerns, so on and so forth. And these groups were established in the UK. So we also have a bit of a sense of how these discussions relate to basically geography in terms of at least offline presence, which is something that is very difficult to do, of course, online, because you can't access people's data, so you have no information about the location of individual contributors, at least accessing in the way we did, of course. And then we saw that more than half of the pages were created with a specific aim of campaigning for one side or the other, and that slightly less were instead created to provide news in a more neutral way. And obviously these two numbers don't add up, because there is a part of pages that we could not use for this analysis, because it's based on what the creators of a Facebook page put in the description and the aim of the page. If they didn't put anything, obviously that's out of the sample. Now, digital heritage ontologies. In terms of agency, what can we say? What we saw in terms of individual agencies, we noticed, of course, interactions and contributions can come potentially from humans or machines. And the interesting bit that we saw in this piece of research was that although we have no way of being certain that there was content created by software and anything related to, for example, all the discussions around Russian interference in Brexit debate and so on and so forth, on top of that, we also had very limited amounts of content that was posted multiple times, although then again, this is a quite old way of identifying bots, essentially, so we can't use that either. We did, however, have presence of Russian media outlets of the type that featured in our news around the time of these discussions, like Sputnik and RT. And we did have very strange case, like the one that I am showing to you now, of a post that was posted multiple times, 15 times, although this was on the pro-Remain side. And it's an article, it includes a link to an article about the Anglo-Saxons, which was published by Martin Wall in the BBC History magazine in 2016. And this was posted on many different Facebook pages, accompanied by a message that was essentially discussing the origin myth that presents the British and the Celts as indigenous people. When we talk about group agency, something that is useful to remember, and which we saw here too, is that these discussions are really showing aggregated individualism, so lots of people expressing their views in ways that tend to remain independent. They tend to talk very little to each other and engage in debate. They just express their opinion. And we saw that in our study, and this is in line also, for example, with research done in the social sciences. There's a really nice article by Del Vicario, I think it's in PLOS One, which really shows, he did a network analysis of pro-Remain and pro-Leave discussions on Brexit as a whole, and showed that there were really two almost completely separate echo chambers, one on the pro-Remain side and one on the pro-Leave side. So this is also good to bear in mind. We're looking at people who are, yes, maybe posting on a page, lots of comments under the same post, but they're not really engaging with one another, if not to a very minimal extent. And now a bit more of our analysis. We started with a data-intensive, after this qualitative framing, we started with a data-intensive analysis to look at the topics that were featuring in Brexit discussions as a whole, to have an idea of the topics that were coming up. We found an optimal number of 15 topics, and then proceeded to identify the topics using just a quite simple topic modeling technique used, LDA. And the topics that were coming up were ranging widely, and including basically all that you would think would come up, from UK stakeholders to discussions of the economy, evaluation of the consequences of the referendum, mobility, social welfare, international relations, people talking about politicians, people talking also about otherness and insecurity, but it's a quite varied range of topics. But if you do the same in the subset of messages that contained references to the past, you saw that your topics are much more around origin, identity, otherness, and particularly cultural and religious otherness, migration. So these are the things that people are talking about in this subset, which is quite different from what we saw from the kind of topics that you saw in the dataset as a whole. This was a bit more like less neat as a kind of analysis. Like there were some topics that we couldn't use because obviously the amount of messages that it's based on is smaller. And this means the dataset is smaller, so this kind of analysis is less fit for the dataset as compared instead to the bigger data, 1.4 million messages that we had for the other. It just produced clearer results. And then we used simple term frequency and term association analysis to identify the terms that were recurring the most in this subset of data, period-specific terms. And so that what was really coming up over and over again was the term Roman, the root barbar, Britannia, we see also Adrian, and then general terms that refer to the medieval and Roman periods. And now the term Roman was coming up in relation to discussions about power dynamics, mobility and discrimination, militarization, occupation and resistance. The term Britannia was coming up over and over again as part of the song Rule Britannia, which is used in a quite nationalist context, and also establishes a link with the period of British imperialism and the great economic success of the UK, for which people express essentially nostalgia. The Roman Empire then proceeded to a qualitative analysis of the data where the Roman Empire was, the term Roman was coming up. And through close reading, qualitative research, we really saw that the term Roman and the Roman world was featuring primarily through a comparison between the European Union and Roman Empire, which is a parallel that has been discussed quite a bit and has also been put forward by politicians. This parallel was used to express oppositions, particularly between civilization and barbarism, between cultural diversity and cultural homogenization, depending on the side on which the person was in. Was it pro-leave or was it pro-remain? Sometimes the same opposition was used by both parts. And in fact, these oppositions that were expressed by this parallel of the Roman Empire were used to mold myths of origin, myths of resistance, and myths of collapse. Myths of origin that could either be on the pro-Remain side, the civilizing power of the Roman Empire / European Union, that was invoked by the pro-Remain camp and opposed to barbarism, the barbarism that came before and after the Roman Empire. And this echoes, for example, a myth, one of the myths of origin that was theorized by Christian Christensen in a book, in a contribution that he made to a book on archaeology and identity in the 1990s, I think 1995. And then a myth of origin around this opposition, is created by the pro-Leave camp, which identifies the origins of Britain in the people, the free people that resisted to the Roman Empire, with Boudica being mentioned as a big symbol of resistance, sometimes together with, in juxtaposition with the British Empire, which is another symbol of freedom and greatness that is invoked. And sometimes there is also discussion around the non-pure origin of Britain from the pro-Remain side. Then myths of resistance, how we should resist to the European Union, this kind of Roman Empire that is domineering and that is smashing down, I think one of the comments said, it is homogenizing culture, creating homogeneity and just not preserving the local diversity that should be preserved. And then myths of collapse. And here you have them used on both sides by the pro-Remain and the pro-Leave. Remain, everything, Great Britain will fall if we leave, but also on the pro-Leave side, the European Union is like the Roman Empire, and it will come to an end as a result of, amongst other things, migration. So this is one of the key and recurring things, migration. So inside, we saw they use the prominence of the prominence of the Roman world in these discussions, and how it was featuring through the parallel of the Roman Empire, European Union, and how this parallel was used to express oppositions that were used sometimes in the same way to argue for opposite ideas that people held. And although there were no direct mentions, with the exception of the article I mentioned and another couple of sources that were talking about past and that were either publishing institutional media outlets or actually academic outputs, we could see really the impact of scholarly thinking filter through education. There was a lot also about, there were quite a few mentions of people saying, I learned in school, or I found in my school books this and that. And then essentially, if we see the prominence of these ideas of civilization and barbarism repeated over and over again, we can see almost still today that a narrative where the Roman Empire arrives and conquers, and the prominence of the Roman world being taught in the English curriculum is an element that you can see in the longer term can contribute towards, in absence of critical thinking, fostering certain polarizations one way or the other. In terms of epistemologies, so the kind of knowledge that we create through this work. One thing that is important to mention, I think, is first of all the extent to which the fitness of the data guides the, not quite the overall research questions, but their fine-tuning and the choice of the case study. For example, Brexit is a perfect one, because Brexit is a word that it's a neologism. It's a word that has been in use since 2013, has very limited semantic ambiguity, is used internationally to mean the same thing, with the exception of a road in Thailand that and this created the perfect case study to look at this through Facebook. But like, it's very telling because I am looking, for example, also at the US-Mexican border debate. Much more difficult to, without going into, obviously, we have been using methods like this, they are disintensive, but they're still based in first instance on the identification of keywords. We haven't used AI, and it's not within our abilities within the team, which is something that I do believe in as well, as part of the argument that I was making. But anyway, it's much more difficult because it is a discussion that is more difficult to capture in boundary terms. It doesn't feature quite in the same way on Facebook, on Twitter. There's less presence of pages around this discussion, for example. It's much more widespread. Secondly, of course, I mean, the data that we use and examine is in constant flux. It disappears once you have mined it and you try to manipulate and prepare for the analysis. It's gone, part of it. So it's difficult also to define the exact, in terms of the exact time scale, even for the data collection to some extent. It's a kind of research that doesn't really, is quantitative, but in it, the idea of representativity and representativeness is not present, essentially. What we are looking at is at a form of data-intensive ethnographies. We've been using this data-intensive technique to extract material and navigate it and understand and scope the topics that are there, and highlight their diversity, rather than basically analyzing their recurrence against a particular population, because what would that population be anyway? The population of Facebook users, we know that those figures aren't quite, might not be as they are communicated. In fact, we know that there were communicated figures that were not actually the actual figures in the past. So my point is that our analysis, that data-intensive ethnographies lose the representational element of traditional quantitative research, and some of the possibilities for contextualization that classically defined ethnographic practice has. So we have very limited information about who the individuals who contributed are, if any at all, and limited information we've seen about also the group agency, the groups behind these analyses. So doing heritage research in a world of big data entails embracing this new and different idea, and an approach that is similar to the qualitative approach that Latour talks about, and which I have included here. So as a way, he talks about this approach as a way to define what is a longer lasting social order without making the assumption that there exist two levels of individuals and structures. And another point is the utility and importance of using both also close reading in conjunction with more data-intensive techniques. and which are essential to really provide more of that context that we know so little of in the first place. And another important point is that close reading, also given the recent changes that there have been in terms of API, is important to try and produce more ethical epistemologies that really allow capturing, for example, not only the posts that are provided by the people who set up a specific Facebook page, but also the comments and replies under those posts, and in this way preserving the integrity of what was the original material rather than portraying a quite partial image of it. And this is a massive problem, for example, also that institutions like the British Library, who are right now trying to collect social media data as part of their collection, are finding they cannot include material provided by non-public figures, but this means that they are creating data sets that are very partial and with voices that are with certain voices that are not included in the record. So to conclude, what I wonder is if doing digital research, digital heritage research in a world of big data is really pointing towards a shift, a paradigm shift that could be summarized in 3 pillars. The first pillar concerns research priorities, and focuses on the investigation of digital heritage ontologies as the processes and outcomes of interacting with elements of the past via online fields, in possible conjunction with offline ones. These ontologies have opaque agency, are constantly mutable temporality, and globalized spatiality. Digital heritages are made by aggregated individualism that escapes clear-cut definitions according to the dimensions of time and geography. And this leads to the second pillar, which is that of data-intensive ethnographies. So the use of data-intensive techniques to navigate big data and explore it, revealing spectra of diversity that are present in our contemporary world, but that we cannot fully measure or quantify against a population. And the third, which is the role of heritage researchers, and particularly a role that can be activist and try to in a way bridge this rift that there is between companies and commercial world, with lots of information about what we do and how we use the past, and the public that can access some of this information through publicly funded research. A researcher also that is more engaged, again, as I was saying, with technicity, and is able to explore some of the challenges and complexities, and also power imbalances that there are in doing this kind of research directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. Really relevant, especially to what's happening today.
Now, yeah, right now.
Questions, please.
I think it's really fascinating, and I think with things like ethnographies, understanding your audience and understanding the character of those people is so important. But like you mentioned, there's difficulties with big data about understanding where these kind of things are coming from. Do you think there's any way, I mean, because historically with things like API, you might be able to get insight into age groups or gender or something like that. Do you think there's any way of somehow kind of addressing that issue of kind of understanding where this, who this data is from and represents? Because I was thinking during the talk, especially with the kind of the archaeological expertise role, people saying, "Oh, well, I was taught at school," but that kind of perspective might become a very specific generation, and might not necessarily reflect other things. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
That is incredibly complicated. Also, like, it's made even more complicated by the GDPR. I'm almost tempted to say that to some extent you might, I feel, I mean, as a next step, I would probably do offline ethnography and then try and see how that data relates to what is happening online, and also perhaps trying to do internet ethnographies in the more traditional terms, which is looking at the interactions of people offline that you have drawn offline, because it is an extremely difficult route to I'm not sure to what extent you could, for example, maybe you could just put in your ethics assessment that you would register an application with Facebook, get it verified, and access certain types of personal data for research purposes. What I don't know exactly is, and I mean it's just coming to being, is what exactly are the criteria that Facebook has for letting you get the application verified. So that's another question, but that maybe these two routes are the ones to pursue. But I do think also in terms of still, the population escapes us in a way, because you have social dimensions. Yeah, well, with all the social dimensions, you could say more, but still, then you would need also to contact them and gather means anyway.
Just wanted to follow up on that though.
Yeah.
That would be an incredibly difficult offline ethnography. You might have to use a proxy and I would hate to see the health and safety assessment for sending somebody in a new citizen of the UK to interview some of these more rabidly pro-Brexit groups.
Yeah, I had a long discussion with Jenny Morgan.
Yes, of course.
About that. Yeah, I mean, you would have to go to like stuff like local party meetings, so on and so forth. But I'm not like, sometimes the material out of 1,400,000 messages, you got these 2005. I mean, the things, in a way, the things that people say online sometimes are perhaps more direct than what some people say online. But also you collect data from perhaps more people who have more extreme views. So it's a balancing act between the online and offline field, put it that way.
Sorry, I jumped over your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, following on from that as well, would you not say that actually the fact that people are aware that they can be prosecuted for things like hate speech and things like that might actually moderate what they're saying online? And how does that affect the integrity of the ethnography? Is that really what they're saying? Is that really a true representation of what they're saying, or would they say go a lot further offline?
That's interesting, and that goes back to my point about being representative of what. What you can look at again, you can only answer maybe certain research questions. Well, this is also quite established in big data studies in general. You can't answer everything because of this problem of representative. So what you can look at is the kind of, for example, what kinds of uses of the past are made, but you're not going to be able to research intentions. So are you going to? That I would argue is difficult offline as well, but certainly online.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you, almost following on from some of that, how is your research able to account for Facebook algorithms and self-selection in joining groups, what people are able to see?
It's not.
No.
It's not. And again, it goes back to what I was saying. You can look at self-selecting. You mean from the account of account of the collector, or
people selecting which groups they are members of? I mean, you showed Celtic Britain first, which I think I followed that. Yeah, they attracted a certain sector, and people being parts of groups and other people who may have not been so vocal in discussions.
It's not. It's not.
Yeah.
You can't say that this represents the exact picture of everything that has been said on Facebook by people since 2013. You cannot say that. Also, think of all the material that has been deleted by, has been deleted, created. You can talk, again, as I was saying, of kinds of uses of the past and make observations around the links that there are between uses of the past and identity, and how people use the past to shape their identities and then relate to contemporary issues. But you can't quantify, you can't talk about these things with the instruments that we've got. Surely Facebook has more sophisticated, perhaps, it would be interesting to have a collaboration with Facebook itself, but I doubt that we'll be able to get some research questions answered that we're interested in. Anyway.
I was wondering, you were bringing up the example of the Roman Empire. For me, in my personal echo chamber of stuff, a lot of discussion about the Roman Empire around Brexit was framed around that multi-hyphen where it's like, what does the Roman Empire do for us?
Yeah, that was mentioned. Yeah.
And I wondered what your sort of insights were from doing this project into how pop culture kind of mediates people's associations with art.
Massively, and that again is tied to also is tied to education, because obviously the way in which TV programming is done is to appeal to specific targets of the population, and you know that if you want to resonate with the population, which is not like to large groups within the population, you need to use information or ideas, images that they're already familiar with, which are surely those that to some extent they've picked up in their own education, and that is the broadest common denominator that you can have, and then you refine. But both education and TV have certainly played a big role. And I haven't done exactly the analysis to look at all the interlinkings, but yes, we've had particularly what the Roman ever did for us was coming up as a question over and over again. So yes, definitely.
Was there, I don't know whether you can actually have got this from your data, but I wondered if there were any geographical patterns emerging in the information and the analysis that you're doing.
Yeah, I wasn't able to do it, unfortunately. That's something that you might be able to do with Twitter data more, and it's impossible with Facebook, because there's no information around about the location where the person posted a certain comment or reply from. That you can access through the API. Of course, they do have it, but it's not accessible. So the only geographic proxy that I had was the one that I was talking about, trying to see. It was the one about the creators of the Facebook pages, because in what is 1/4, so it's not much, but 1/4 of the total, they were basically part of groups that were present offline, and you have also the location of those. So you have the location of those for sure. So you have Brexiteers, areas that are coming up, but also Londoners that are coming up. And even there you see quite a bit of polarization. There's an interesting thing that I wanted to say in relation to the relation between the online and the offline. Because I did this study and I didn't include, I just only presented like a tiny bit of the data, but something that also came up was there's a topic that is about coal mining and the idea that coal mining stopped in North England because of the European Union. There's this association, and therefore the argument draws the conclusion that we should leave the European Union. And in Newcastle, Rhiannon Mason's group is doing research on sites looking at industrial heritage and perceptions of heritage, and she found the same thing. So I think that, you know, it is valuable insights, and obviously if they use them to basically manipulate voting, it is, you know, there is stuff there, and it can be weaponized, and that was one of my points. But you can also look at very kind of detailed, in a way, perceptions like this one through these two, and when you do the offline triangulation, sometimes, as in this case, it does completely independently come up as well.
Are there any questions online, Megan?
We didn't have any on Twitter. Let me share the screen and see if we have any on Facebook. We don't have any on Facebook.
Any other questions? One last one from the audience. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Really
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The usual room is actually reserved tonight for the Evelyn Child. So hope to see a lot of you there. Finish off these